always happy to have one. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So this is my first official faculty pub night, so forgive me any mistakes I make tonight, anything I forget. So welcome. My name is Rhonda Rosen, and I'm now the Programming and Exhibitions Librarian here at Hannon Library. On behalf of our entire team, welcome to Faculty Pub Night. So for tonight's Faculty Pub Night, we're going to feature Dr. Arnab Banerji, Assistant Professor of Theater Arts, who's going to discuss his recent publication entitled What Lies Beyond Hattamala, Badal, Sircar, and his third theater as an alternate trajectory for intercultural theater. I think you did that to me on purpose, all those words. Yeah. So a little housekeeping before we begin. It would be lovely if all phones were muted. Faculty Pub Night is not for faculty only, but rather it is meant to shine a light on our wonderful faculty with the whole LMU community of students, staff, and our colleagues, as well as our campus visitors. So please spread the word and come again and bring a friend. Please note that we have a lovely array of food and drink at the back, so if you are hungry or thirsty during the presentation, you are welcome to get up and bring food back to your chair. Second, we do take the word pub seriously, as you can see by our lovely beer and wine, but of course we will be checking IDs as any good pub does. So on your chairs, please note the small white form for you to fill out. Your feedback helps us plan future programming events. Thank you, Chris. And an added incentive, please be sure to include your email address on it so that you will be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. So we will have a Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So if you could hold any questions until then. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Kala Seal, Professor of Information Systems and Business Analytics, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
demonstrate, never emerges into its own as a consequence of the careless intercultural experiments which characterize his core theatrical practices.
Sorry, I think the one is.
It's not doing its job correctly. Okay. And although, oh wow, that is a marked difference, all right. Don't have to project anymore, excellent. And although venerated by some contemporary practitioners as path-breaking, his third theater fails to have a lasting impact on Indian theater beyond token inclusions in academic circles as an experimental curiosity. So that is what we are trying to do here. It is tempting, however, to evaluate Sircar and his work within the discourses of post-coloniality, because Sircar's dates, as we will find, we'll see, and his emergence into a theater artist happened after the end of India as a British colony, so post-1947. However, as Erika Fischer-Lichte and others have explained, post-colonial theory has always been more interested in the political over the aesthetic experience of a cultural work. The aesthetic dimension, Fischer-Lichte explains, has been evaluated under the aegis of intercultural performance, and hence I use intercultural performance as the lens through which to evaluate all of this, to Badal Sircar and his theater. So intercultural theater. The first edition of the Asian Theatre Journal in 1984 included an incendiary article by Rustam Bharucha, A Collision of Cultures, Some Western Interpretations of the Indian Theatre. Bharucha picked specific examples from the creative and critical oeuvre of prominent Western theatre critics and practitioners and critiqued their treatment of elements of Indian theatre. Bharucha stated in the piece that the exemplary attitudes that he scrutinizes in his substantial essay correspond to an, and I quote, attitude to the East that is shaped by certain constructs and images of the Orient that prevail in the West, end quote. The essay provoked a rather strong back and forth between Bharucha and one of his subjects of inquiry in the essay, the performance studies scholar Richard Schechner. Schechner argued in a response that was included in the second issue of the journal that Bharucha demonstrated a significant lack of understanding of not only his, but also of Western approaches to Eastern art forms in general. Bharucha responded by using examples from Schechner's own body of work on intercultural performance, such as the pitfalls of imagining the other as, I quote, not another, but the projections of one's own ego, end quote. The fierce rat-a-tat between these two scholars more than 3 decades ago is a testament to the anxiety surrounding intercultural performance, especially between members of a source culture with those from an appropriating culture. The academic debate is just so interesting. That is the opening argument of a journal. This is a journal that is coming into being. This is a new field or subfield that is being inaugurated, and the first 3 issues are all about this debate. Bharucha has now moved from that critical position that he has taken. Schechner, who's an amazing Bollywood dancer, by the way, I say this from personal experience. I've danced Bollywood with him. Whiskey was involved. But it's pretty amazing that he has stuck to his position. That we need to look at the East and learn from it and learn more about ourselves rather than learn about the other culture, which is a very interesting approach if you think about it. I revisited this exchange to refresh my memory of how interculturalism has been construed and imagined as a process of cultural evaluation and appropriation where the agency lies with the Western observer, academic, or performer. Bharucha's critique identifies Schechner as an interlocutor who not only controlled but also dominated and shaped the conversation around the use of Eastern cultural artifacts indiscriminately in his creative pursuits. Critics like David Williams, while writing about Aryan Manushkin, another example of the intercultural performance world, if you will, Aryan Manushkin's Le Théâtre du Soleil, or Patrice Pavis's extolling of Brooks' Mahabharata, which is, incidentally, the favorite punching bag of intercultural performance. If there's one thing that you need to know about intercultural performance scholars, is they hate the Mahabharata, whether they have seen it or not. Someone, if you're my age, you've probably never seen it because it was done before I was born. But even if you have seen the 4-hour recording of it, you have to hate it. It's kind of a given. Unless, otherwise you won't be welcomed into the club. I don't like it very much. Have, on the other hand, praised the ways in which these artists have been able to summarize the Indian experience within the confines of their respective expansive stage spaces and vocabularies. At the same time, however, intercultural performance was a way for artists specializing in what Pavis calls the superior bowl of source culture to exploit a global marketplace for their art form. Schechner references some instances of showcasing Eastern cultural artifacts in the West under the aegis of the Intercultural project. He does not seem to be cognizant at the time of the economic forces at play facilitating such cultural exchanges. The Intercultural project, albeit controversial, sometimes allowed non-Western artists to earn coveted and elusive dollars to complement the meager institutional or private support received at home, in the source culture, that is. The interest of Western enthusiasts in a particular form often determine the extent and length of support that an artist or an art form receives. So, you find an artist in India who does Kalaripaettu, for example. You bring that person over, you give that person a month-long residency, you learn whatever you want to learn from it, then that person has to go back, right? So the person from the West, or from the vantage point of here, let's say, we control how this exchange is facilitated. That person often does not have the agency to dictate the terms of their engagement. And when they do, there is often resentment. And that is true even now, and even for people like me. There was this dance scholar who wanted to come here. She's a scholar. She wanted to make a scholarly presentation, but she expected a fee. And I was like, I can't have this conversation with anyone, not even with colleagues around LA, because who has $4,000 as a speaking fee for a scholar? We can't do that. So there is often that agency is missing. $4,000 is a crazy amount of money, but still that agency is missing. They cannot control that conversation. Patrice Pavis's inferior bowl of the target culture, so Pavis, who's a French, British, German scholar of intercultural performance, considers the Western culture to be the inferior bowl into which the superior bowl of the Eastern culture is informing and giving, lending cultural information for them to use. The Patrice Pavis's inferior bowl of the target culture in his hourglass structure, which is that, of cultural transmission, recognizes the hegemony of the process, albeit as an excuse to the unbridled borrowing from the East by the West. Pavis's structure for cultural transfer, however, discounts the sociocultural hegemony that the West and Western artists bring into the equation during cultural exchanges. His mischaracterization of the self-effacing inferior bowl obfuscates the misuse and misappropriation of cultural artifacts that has been questioned by the critiques of intercultural projects. My aspiration, however, is to nuance and substantiate the conversation on interculturalism by demonstrating that the phenomenon is often a two-way street. This street is fraught with problems on either side, especially when the appropriating culture does not understand nor tries to understand the source culture adequately. The resulting conversation peels back more layers and allows a deeper insight into the intercultural phenomenon and reveals how it was always and already a tool substantiating a Western claim as not only the center of global culture, but as the savior of non-Western traditions from ignominy. Bengali theater's colonial origins and revolutionary influences. The practices of Bengali group theaters from Calcutta, Eastern India, or Kolkata, Eastern India, are arguably one of the greatest drivers of India's active contemporary theater culture. Performance companies, largely amateur in structure, calling themselves groups, produce and perform plays on shoestring budgets throughout the year in the dozen or so performance venues of Kolkata and its suburbs. Group theater is distinct from the several indigenous performance forms that originate in the rural hinterlands of Bengal. Group theater is essentially urban in nature. The group theater often integrates indigenous performance vocabulary into its performative structure while retaining its urban character. Group theater plays embody a very particular kind of neoliberal aesthetic that celebrates the proscenium stage and a cerebral acting school of performance. The roots of the Kolkata-based group theatre's cultural bias towards the formal Western structures of performance can be traced to the colonial character of the region's earliest theatre histories dating back to the 18th century. So, the Kolkata Nouveau Riche were inspired by the colonial entertainment of the British settlers to start experimenting with European-style theatre. Arguably, the first Bengali proscenium-style performance was heralded by a European. That, well, this dude's picture is not there, but that bill is from that first performance. Gerasim Stepanovich Lebedev. The pictures of this person that you find online are cartoonish. And there is a cartoonish image of the person from the Russian archive. He's from St. Petersburg, where his first grammar of the Bengali and the Hindi languages is preserved. He was a linguist. But even that picture, that portrait is, I don't like it. So you don't get to see it. I control this narrative. This is my intercultural show. So Gerasim Stepanovich Lebedev, 1749 to 1817, a native of St. Petersburg, Russia, and a self-taught violinist, Lebedev found his way to India with an English band. His life is fascinating. He went to Austria. He wanted to learn the two Indian languages. Then he took a ship, went to Chennai, which is in southern India. It was known as Madras earlier. And he employed a linguist to teach him Sanskrit. Now, if you know nothing about Madras, you should know one thing. They are extremely puritanical. So, the linguist, the person that he hired was a Brahmin, which is the upper caste, and Stepanovich is from Russia, so no Brahmin there. And he was told, well, you cannot learn this language belongs to Brahmins, bye-bye. He took a boat, went upriver, came to Calcutta, where, we are, as Kalada said, we love our scotch and we love our meat. So we were like, absolutely, come, brother, let's teach you some Bengali while you want to learn. He wanted to learn Sanskrit, but we were like, we'll throw in Bengali for you. You want some Hindi as well? But primarily Bengali and Sanskrit, which is what he learned. And his teacher, Babu Goloknath Das, inspired Lebedev to, and I quote, present his play publicly. So one of his language exercises was to translate two plays. These two plays were the Bengali language translations of a Molière and a little-known English play known as The Disguise. At its very inception then, the modern Bengali theatre aimed at creating a desi, which is the catch-all phrase used to talk about South Asians, a desi version of a foreign original. The performative circumstances thus inaugurated continued to the early days of the Kolkata theatre and has bled into its modern-day iterations as well. But hold on, there's always an exception. The modernist playwright, Rabindranath Tagore, that good-looking man there, a lot of good-looking images of this person is available. And as Kalada will tell you, if you're a Bengali, you have to mention this person at least once, while talking about Bengali culture. Otherwise, you are not a Bengali. And illiterate, so I consider myself to be not only literate, but a rather proud Bengali. So I've done my due. The modernist playwright Rabindranath Tagore was possibly an exception whose style, while embodying Western principles, went over and beyond and fiercely exerted its own originality. Tagore was Bengal's most celebrated literary icon, continues to be Bengal's most celebrated literary icon, and is India's national poet, was no less a theatre enthusiast himself. And being the creative genius that he was, Tagore went on to revolutionize Bengali dramatic writing with his fiercely original work. It is unfortunate, however, that most of Tagore's theatrical creation was not widely accepted by Bengali theatre experts of the time. Critics, both in the West and in India, have spent a lot of time trying to pin a Western critical trajectory onto Tagore's work, but as Anandulal observed, Tagore's, and I quote, characteristic plays come across as entirely Indian, unquote, and are undoubtedly, I quote again, the exclusive product of an Indian genius, end quote. I am tempted to surmise that theatre makers during Tagore's lifetime were unable to assess and appreciate his work because there was no available Western reference for them to evaluate the work against. This is perhaps also why critics aiming an appraisal of Tagore sought to draw parallels between Western dramatists and Tagore rather than evaluating his work simply on its own merits. And that still continues to happen even to this day. Tagore is underproduced and definitely underappreciated as a dramatist. His plays and his poems, in fact, if you're at a Calcutta traffic stop, you will hear a Tagore song. I am not kidding. The government in its, infinite glory and wisdom decided that playing songs at traffic signals would calm you down. It has the exact opposite effect. But, governments, they are irrational. So now, contemporary Bengali theater, the kind that one can see in Kolkata today, the kind that I research, the kind that I publish on more commonly, is a 20th century phenomenon. The theater stemmed from the ruins of a progressive sociocultural movement that emerged in the early 20th century, paralleling the nascent communist movement in India. The Indian People's Theatre Association, henceforth IPTA, that's the blue logo on the side, was created in 1943 to realize the potential of popular theatre as an effective weapon in the fight for national liberation from British imperialism and fascism, and in the struggles of peasants, workers, and other oppressed classes. No wonder they failed. Those are very large words, a large description. The IPTA began functioning as the cultural wing of the CPI, which is that organization there, the Communist Party of India, although the organization was officially identified as the cultural front of a different progressive organization to avoid administrative crackdown. The IPTA membership was drawn from a fairly wide socioeconomic spectrum. The group's stated objective was to create a pan-India people's theater movement that aimed at erasing artists' voice against the present rulers of the country, the British. And for the purposes of the present discussion, the immediate inspiration for IPTA was, however, not homegrown, but like its governing ideology of communism, a foreign import. Darshan Chaudhuri, who has studied the IPTA to quite an extent, notes that the immediate influences and inspiration behind the formation of the IPTA were several left-leaning sociocultural organizations from across the world. For example, the People's Theatre from Russia, Chinese People's Theatre from China, and Romarolla's The People's Theatre. Not unlike their Russian and Chinese counterparts, the Indian communists imagined the Cultural Front as a close ally to effecting social change in the country. Like the Russian People's Theatre, IPTA members created small plays that were easily transportable to the remotest corners of the vast and unwieldy subcontinent of South Asia. But in spite of its progressive messaging, liberal agenda, and concerted opposition to the decadence of the Bengali commercial stage, the IPTA brand of theatre was essentially a foreign import repackaged for consumption in India. Moving on to the other form of theatre. That's one of Bengali theatre's great actors, Shambhu Mitro, who's playing Galileo there. You can tell I don't really like the guy by the image I chose to put on there. There are some flattering images of this person that are available as well, but I take exception to him. So hence you get to see that. The Bengal branch of the IPTA, arguably one of its most active units, disintegrated in March 1948, crumbling under the pressures of concerted attack on the Communist Party by the Indian National Congress-led federal government. A little more than a month later, in May 1948, Shambhu Mitro, that gentleman there, erstwhile senior member of the Bengal IPTA, launched an independent performance company, Bohurupi, that's the logo of that company, ushering in what is known as the New Theatre Movement or the Nabonatya movement. The New Theatre Movement, which eventually became referred to as the Group Theatre Movement, is a hybrid of a colonial performance aesthetic with its characteristic decadence and a progressive performance vocabulary that is minimalistic and message-driven. Even though both styles that individually informed and led to Bengali group theatre were revolutionary in their own right, they were nevertheless foreign. This exercise of borrowing and drawing inspiration from cultural elements that are not necessarily indigenous is an intercultural exercise. And Bengali theatre, from its earliest history, has embodied it wholeheartedly. The period since 1948 has witnessed Bohurupi splintering into multiple smaller groups, with these groups generating a steady repertoire of performances in Kolkata and its suburbs. It is interesting, however, that even in the last 7 decades, each period of new development in the Bengali theatre continues to be inspired by imbibing an international style into its ever-expanding toolkit. Following closely on the heels of Bahurupi, several groups that either splintered from Mitra's stream or from a team that had already separated itself from this parent organization began crowding the parallel theater, Kolkata theater circles. Notable among them is the group Nandikar with that fancy logo that looks like a human face with an N that was designed by an Oscar winner, which until recently was celebrated in the city for its fondly remembered adaptations of Pirandello, Brecht, and Chekhov. The same holds true for Chetona, which is the group at the bottom with the face, with an actual face. Another one amongst the old vanguards of Kolkata-based theater. And even when content was locally sourced, as is in the case of Onno Theater, which is the logo on top, next to the face-looking thing, production of Madhav Malonchi Konna, the stylistic choices remain persistently foreign in inspiration. Even the most prolific and eclectic amongst Bengali playwrights, Mohit Chattopadhyay, the gentleman in the center, and Utpal Datto, the gentleman at the very end, the playwright that Kalada was talking about, frequently drew inspiration from literary predecessors in the Euro-American traditions, as discussed by Dharwadkar, amongst others. More recently, and especially in the last decade or so, more Bengali group theaters have turned to sharing and telling homegrown stories. The shift is a result, perhaps, of the ease with which not only foreign plays, but foreign travel has become accessible to Bengali directors and actor-managers. The exposure to international theaters and the latest in theater design, tech, and use of space has found its way into contemporary Bengali theater, however, at a much lower production value. Among the steady stream of foreign imports that has had a telling impact on contemporary Bengali theater performance is avant-garde anti-establishment theater introduced, performed, and promoted by Badal Sircar. Of course I have sound effects. I'm a theater person. So, Badal Sircar and the shortcomings of Bengali interculturalism, as I call it. That's Badal Sircar. So you can tell if I have mixed feelings about him. That's a pretty good photo of him. Right? Yeah. So Badal Sircar was born on July 15, 1925 in Kolkata in what Anjum Katyal, a biographer, has called, and I quote, a middle class family. This is probably a unique Indian classification. We have middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class. Then there are other words that get thrown into the middle class mix because the Indian middle class is non-existent. There is recent research that proves that the monikers of middle class cannot be applied to the Indian society. It's just a misdirected thing. Sircar, this person, who happens to be Shayantika's neighbor, actually, I should mention that. Shayantika saw this person growing up. She lived 2 doors away from him, had no idea that she was going to get married to a theater person, called this person crazy her entire life because he was always seated at his desk busily writing whatever it is that he was writing, and knew them very well. He used to give them sweets. He was Christian, so he would give them sweets out on various Hindu celebrations. But then when I told her finally that, I know this person. I know all about him. I've been to his house. He was like, well, you should have thought about looking a couple of doors down earlier. I did later. Badal Sircar was born on July 15, 1925. Sircar was a voracious reader and enjoyed reading plays, particularly comedies. Katyal, the same biographer, calls his insatiable reading of Bengali plays and his addiction to radio plays the seeds that sowed a lifelong love for the theater in the young man. Monujendra Kundu, another biographer, in his critical assessment of Sircar's work reminds us that the studious Sircar was an introvert and suffered from an inferiority complex that also affected his participation in the theater. Sircar blames his middle-class status as well as the psychological pressure from the society around him for not pursuing theater even during his college days. Sircar and his friends continued grappling with the political ideologies and found it hard to come to terms with any particular ideology that appealed to them. Sircar, Kundu tells us, blamed himself late into his life for his youthful callousness and nonchalance about both local and global events. Sircar's disillusionment with the CPI leadership and their commitment to the communist ideology continued to haunt the young engineer. Sircar discovered the British town planner Thomas Sharp's celebrated 1940 book, Town Planning, shortly after moving into relatively comfortable government housing in central Kolkata. This accidental meeting was to change the course of his life. He enrolled himself in a 2-year diploma on town planning at his alma mater, BE College. And he followed this up with another 2-year coursework on town planning at the University College London in 1957. Sircar's stint in London, as recorded and reported by him, and as discussed extensively by Kundu, this latter biographer that I was mentioning earlier, seems to have had a decisive effect on Sircar's continued but little explored interest in theatre. Sircar used his meager resources to regularly watch the stalwarts of the British stage perform during his time in London. He did not particularly care about musical comedy, but seemed to have taken a liking for American domestic realism, reporting that Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night particularly moved him. Upon his return to India in 1959, Sircar joined the Calcutta Municipal Corporation as a valuer and surveyor. The most important episode, however, during this period of transition was the beginning of a theatre group called Chokro. Chokro was a cultural group that got together on Saturdays for the members to discuss anything to their liking. Invariably, due to Sircar's presence, and the group would present plays. Boro Pishima, elder paternal sister, aunt, as the title would translate, was one of the first plays that Sircar wrote in April 1959 as one of the first presentations from this group. Very soon, the group started getting invited to present Sircar's plays across a variety of venues. It was during this moment of feverish activity that one of modern India's greatest theatrical masterpieces, the abstract absurdist play Ebong Indrajit and Indrajit, was created in 1963. This landmark text was published with the young critic Shomik Bandyopadhyay's assistance in the celebrated theatre journal Bohurupi, a publication of the Shambhu Mitra-led group that we spoke about earlier in the presentation. Sircar, however, was not one to be tied down with the name, fame, and attention that this play garnered across the nation. So this is 1963, right? So India is only a 16-year-old country at this point, and it still doesn't have a consciousness as a nation. And this play, which talks about the uncertainties of young Indians who were born either when India was becoming independent or immediately before that, and how and why and what they're processing around their milieu, caught everyone's attention. It was translated into almost all major Indian languages in the next couple of years and performed all over the country. So it immediately made this man, who was only a theater outsider, so to speak, an engineer interested in town planning, was dabbling into theater, and a celebrity author all over the country, which is very interesting. And during this time, he left for France and then later in Nigeria, where he landed a job in Enugu. In between, Sircar visited Kolkata, where he revived Chokro, the group that he used to work for, and held readings and staged some of his new work. During this time, the theatre group Bohurupi, mentioned earlier, signed an agreement with him to exclusively stage his works. This arrangement continued until the 1960s, when Sircar moved back to India after the Nigerian Civil War broke out. Sircar, Kundu reminds us, had agreed to work with Bohurupi because he had felt that there was quite a lot to be learned from Shambhu Mitra, the patriarch of Bohurupi, that guy who was smiling with that weird smile. That's Galileo, by the way, in one of the earlier slides. And Bohurupi, on their part, although by now an acclaimed theatre group, lacked a steady resource for original work, and Mitra did not fail to notice Sircar's genius in some of his early work. Kundu correctly assesses the contribution of Bohurupi and Shambhu Mitra in molding Sircar's early career by giving the young maverick playwright a steady platform to showcase his work on the national stage, even though the playwright occasionally disagreed with the dramaturgical interference of the group and his director. So Shambhu Mitra, I called him a patriarch a second ago. He was a real patriarch. Like, there are stories about how a scenic designer had designed the set for one of his plays, one of the most celebrated productions of one of the plays that the group did. And the group traveled somewhere with the play, and the director did not like part of the scenic design. So on the day of the show, without consulting the designer, he just chopped off the top of the set and was like, yeah, it doesn't fit the space, so we have to make do with it. And he considered himself to be a guru which, if you know the value of that word, it's someone that you submit yourself to in order to learn from, and is not necessarily a teacher or a mentor, where there is more of an exchange that goes on. So he called himself a guru. So there were those problems that happened. Kundu notes that Sircar's own company, Shatabdi, this thing, was created on August 29, 1967. The initial iteration of the company was, however, short-lived because Sircar, the playwright, closed it soon out of what Kundu describes as, and I quote, apathy and exasperation, end quote. In spite of a national reputation as a playwright, Sircar does not appear settled as a performer in the years immediately preceding the beginning of this theater group. Sircar can be seen to be searching for a form that would be uniquely his, a form that would distinguish him as an artist. And yet he was unable to zero in on either a language or a performance idiom that was separate from the theater that was playing around him. It was perhaps to give his search a new platform that Sircar quit the steady performance platform that he had with his agreement with Bohurupi and created this group, a venture that didn't satisfy him to the extent that he wanted it to. At the time of Shatabdi's creation, however, Sircar was already an important name in the national theater scene, thanks to his most well-known work, Ebong Indrajit, the cover of which we saw earlier. The exposure and fame that his work accorded him allowed him to be selected on a government-sponsored cultural tour of the USSR and Eastern Europe. During this tour, Sircar records, he saw, and I quote, I'm going to butcher all of these names, Yuri Lyubimov's production of The Good Person of Shedzwan, Galileo, 10 Days That Shook the World, and the rehearsals of Mother at the Taganka Theater in Moscow, end quote. Besides these, Sircar was also exposed to Jari's pantomime and the work of the, again I'm going to butcher this, the Sinohorny Club in Prague, and the work and philosophy of Jerzy Grotowski. All of this was to have a decisive impact on his ultimate formulation of what is known as the Third Theater. Back in Kolkata, Sircar staged 3 of his proscenium plays with a rejuvenated Shatabdi, the same group. The productions, however, still did not reflect his experience and exposure to the avant-garde theater that he had witnessed abroad, except for a partial application of Grotowski's poor theater. Kundu reports, based on Sircar's own observations from these early experiments, that his use of the Grotowskian approach to theater allowed Sircar to make his theater vocabulary inexpensive and take advantage of the perpetual penury of theater groups in Kolkata. It's true, it's hand-to-mouth existence. People don't get paid to do theater, most of them at least don't. So it's still very true about this penury, and that this group and being able to perform plays with that, and it's a Getty Images image, which is why they're all in this uniform sort of a costume. Typically, they just wear street clothes and they're on stage just like who they are. At the same time, Kundu reminds us, Sircar was celebrating himself as a herald, leading the theater practice in Kolkata in a hitherto unexplored direction towards Third Theater. Anjum Katyal, in her laudatory appraisal of Sircar's work, paraphrases the latter's thought process that led to the Third Theater. Katyal writes, and I quote, "In a nutshell, there is a dichotomy between the existing rural folk traditional theater, which is the First Theater, and the Western-influenced proscenium stage of the City Theater, which is the Second Theater. His attempt, that is Badal Sircar's attempt, is to explore the possibility of a synthesis between these two, which would be the Third Theater, which is the middle ground. It is interesting that Sircar's hope and aspiration to synthesize the folk with the urban seems so similar to the Western quest for the pure or the universal underlying much of the intercultural project. That is what the Western artists were looking at. If you look at the archaeology of theater project that comes out of Denmark, you'll see that there are all these line drawings that they create for Balinese dancers, Odissi dancers, and Western dancers, was showing that the postures of the body fit into the schema that has universal application, which I just think is wrong. But it is interesting that Sircar's, so even though set on a direction, Sircar felt that his training was inadequate to undertake this project single-handedly. Accordingly, he responded to an invitation accorded to him by Richard Schechner, the Bollywood dancer, also performance studies scholar, whom he had met in Kolkata in 71 to visit New York and observe the work of Schechner's company, the Performance Group. Sircar left for New York in July 72. Over the next several weeks, Sircar watched several off-Broadway and off-Broadway performances, attended rehearsals of the Performance Group, met with avant-garde theater artists Judith Malina and Julian Beck of the Living Theater, visited UC Berkeley and Vancouver as a guest of the Performance Group, and learned the work of the group and its leader Schechner from very close quarters. But even before his visit to North America, Sircar and Shatabdi had attended workshops led by Anthony Sergio, director of the La Mama Theatre in Calcutta. This workshop introduced Sircar to the CAT series set of exercises formulated by Grotowski. The international experiences of Sircar hint at the significance of imported and borrowed ideas to Sircar's theatrical vision. Sircar muses on the significance of training in the classical arts and otherwise while observing the perseverance of the Performance Group and other North American avant-gardists to working on acquiring the craft. Sircar draws a relationship between Bharatnatyam and sitar training to that of the avant-gardists. He, however, does not connect the dots to their deliberate study of traditional Indian theater training, the rigor and strict regimen of which were an inspiration for the Schechners and the Grotowskis in crafting their Western-located, rigorous, reclusive, and exclusive training routines. Schechner found Sircar's interest in his methods of performance training to be the continuation or completion, as he called it, of an interesting circle. Schechner remarks, and I quote, "Badal's use of the ideas and exercises that he observed that summer completed a very interesting circle, because I had learned the core of these exercises from Grotowski, who had taken them or adapted at least of them from Kathakali. I taught them to Sircar, who brought them back to Calcutta." Schechner was undoubtedly thrilled with being able to equip an Indian theater person with the wherewithal and vocabulary of an Indian performance form. Yet Schechner's exposure of Sircar to this performance form and training through his own Western lens seems to have ultimately have had a pedagogical rather than a practical effect on Sircar and his work. Bharucha and Strampikal, both scholars of performance, both seem to have picked up on this gray area of Sircar's work, albeit with different levels of critical insight and engagement. Bharucha, while not belittling Sircar's stance, dubbed Sircar and Shatabdi's frequent rural sojourns to stage their work as exercises, and I quote, "in self-depreciation and romanticization of rural life," end quote. Stramprikal's reports from the field, after mentioning what he felt were natural and folk connections in Sircar's work, record the observations of a young theater enthusiast who is only able to appreciate the playwright's work from a distance. He also records Sircar's use of abstract techniques in his village workshops, which failed to connect with his attendees. And this is something that the group would do very often. They would just go on these retreats, what they called, and tour rural performance areas. And instead of learning from them, he would try to inform their art practice with what he had learned. Theater director Haisnam Kanhailal, who is an internationally celebrated director from Manipur, he attended Sircar's workshop in Imphal after the latter returned from North America, armed with the latest from Schechner and Grotowski toolsheds. In 1972 first, and then again in 1973. Kanhailal reminisces that Sircar's emphasis on breaking quote-unquote urban sophistication and his use of games like mirroring and blind were learned from foreign teachers who had in turn appropriated those techniques from other cultures. These issues, Kanhailal opines, were not of concern to Manipur and its theater enthusiasts, many of whom were not plagued by urbanity and sophistication. These are rural people. They live in the hinterlands. Part of their training, regular training outside of Sircar's influence, would be on imbibing the performance milieu of surrounding them and using that in informing their body. But Sircar seemed to be oblivious to that. Sircar's games were not only too familiar to the Manipuris, whose indigenous cultures had already had versions of these exercises in his active social repertoire. Kundu chronicles several other instances from nearer home about Sircar's workshops in the Sundarban hinterlands, as well as his work with prostitutes in Kolkata's red light district. All of these associations, Kundu argues and shows based on anecdotal evidence, demonstrate Sircar's urbanity, urban sophistication, and inability to communicate with the masses, and his forceful imposition of a top-down, largely foreign theater training regimen. Sircar unabashedly agreed that he had not spent any considerable amount of time learning about Indian folk and traditional performance. And yet, he criticized folk and traditional performance forms for being, and I quote, principally heavy with backward or reactionary ideology, end quote. This is from a person who has not really studied the art forms that he's critiquing. Perhaps to justify his occasional and disconcerted efforts at lifting from the myriad folk theater vocabularies to suit his urban practice. In his treatise on the third theater, Sircar writes that his explanation of the approach that he is proposing might seem like he is, and I quote, influenced by the experimental theater of Europe and America, and that his sole purpose is to import these practices to India. He goes on to say that based on his personal experience, he has learned that Western practitioners learned a lot from the Indian folk theater, while city-bred theater artists in Kolkata continue to neglect what lies around them, a treasure trove of source material. The truth, as Kundu so painstakingly proves, is that Sircar, like his city-bred brethren in the Kolkata theater fraternity, knew little to nothing of traditional Indian performance, and these forms therefore did not affect his thinking about the third theater in any significant way, despite his protestations. Kundu reproduces comparable excerpts and anecdotal references from the works of Schechner, Grotowski, Littlewood, and Lumibov next to Sircar's writing to demonstrate that these theater thinkers, directors, and practitioners were the central influences inspiring Sircar to create his synthesized form of theater. In other words, Sircar adopted and infused practices that were hardly ever indigenous to his immediate surroundings to create a hybrid form that is primarily dependent on consciously imported technique. His propensity to elevate Western models as a central examples in forming his work was not new to Sircar during his development of the third theater. Even his most well-regarded and celebrated play, Ebong Indrajit, which was first published in 1965, may have been influenced by Sircar's reading of contemporary Western lyrical playwrights during his time in London. The absurdness that was ascribed to this text by the directors who encountered the play supposedly prompted Sircar to investigate this style of playwriting. He had no idea about it, but he wanted and went and looked into it. He, however, dismissed any influence of this school of writing on his work. Kundu argues that the bourgeois urban middle-class sentimentality, angst, and existentialism so palpable throughout the play is rather reflective of Sircar's own middle-class roots and upbringing. Even if directly influenced by Western dramaturgies of the theater of the absurd in vogue at the time, Ebong Indrajit stands on its own merits, and this and Sircar's other theatrical works were able to capture the imagination of theater makers across India in 1970s onwards. The point is, however, that Sircar's theater was neither a rote Western imitation nor unique or specific to his socio-economic surroundings. It was an intercultural enterprise whose influence on the international evolution of this performance genre during the period has yet to be fully investigated or even acknowledged. During a freewheeling interview, the noted theater director Prabir Guho from the Kolkata suburb of Modhamgram elaborated how theater practices are shaped by region, food habit, climate, and upbringing. He suggested that a practice crafted for a sausage-eating, beer-guzzling German performer would fail to work on a rice-eating, tea-sipping Bengali, and vice versa. Similarly, Guho continued, a performance practice with its roots in the soil and air of Purulia or Birbhum districts in Bengal cannot be superimposed on the urban finesse of someone born and raised in Kolkata and vice versa. He opined that in spite of these differences, it would be possible to facilitate cultural exchange between distant and disparate cultures. He demonstrated this by using the example of his own theater group's work with traditional art forms. Actors are sent to the villages of Purulia and Birbhum to train on a traditional art form. When they return after an intensive series of workshops and are excited to immediately implement the lessons in their work in the city, they are submerged again into the regular training regime of their own urban theater language. It is not until after a month that the performers are asked to recall certain physical actions from the experience of several weeks ago. Whatever their bodies and minds remember, Guho concluded, is what the intercultural exchange can facilitate and no more. A top-down imposition of a regimented intercultural practice, like the one Sircar imported from his tryst with Western avant-gardists, institutionalizes an imbalanced cultural transformation but doesn't facilitate an exchange. Like Bharucha, I believe in the possibilities of intercultural exchange. The exchange, however, should be such that it opens up spaces of exploration and dialogue rather than creating abstract, exclusive silos for artistic practice, like the ones that Sircar's blind copying of Western practices seems to have spawned. As this chapter argues and demonstrates, cultural appropriation is not simply a Western tactic of incorporating Eastern performance aesthetics onto its performance vocabulary. It is an equally fraught territory when practitioners from the global South misappropriate non-local art practices. Interrogating this parallel version of intercultural practice allows us a deeper critical insight into intercultural performance practice and aesthetics and the ways in which it guarantees Western hegemonic ideas of cultural superiority. The Kolkata-based Bengali proscenium theatre developed primarily under British influence and in order to emulate British performance, has continued to sustain and enrich itself with creative content and critical input from a Western performance vocabulary, often only after encountering the same very briefly. This pattern of intercultural exchange replicates the cultural appropriation of the West to East exchanges of the previous centuries. The uncritical celebration of Occidentalism, however, and especially in this case, reinforces the status quo by accepting rather than challenging the cultural hegemony of the West. Badal Sircar, one of Kolkata theatre's most celebrated artists, was a wholehearted votary of this form of cultural exchange and built his legacy by appropriating Western theatrical idioms and imposing them on an Indian milieu. In his experiments, Sircar's theatre never became the symbiotic third theatre that he proposed, one that embodies both the rural and the westernized urban Indian theatre. With his very urban concerns and his very urban training, both in India and abroad, in both political ideology and performance practice, Sircar was never able to rise beyond his urban sophistication and its reliance on Western practices as the blueprint for theatrical advancement. Consequently, his plays, which did not lack dramatic merit but were not ideologically or stylistically original, remained urban in their effect and purpose. Sircar and his group toured around Bengal extensively and were received enthusiastically by theatre enthusiasts and masses alike, perhaps in the same vein that Bharucha believes a young boy masquerading as Rama in Brooklyn would be, an alien exhibit. The failure of Sircar to include the life of Bengal in his theatre that Bharucha was too soon to pronounce as its distinguishing characteristics is perhaps the reason that Sircar's brand of theatre lost its appeal in the early 90s. Kundu observes, based on the astute survey of Sircar's autobiography, anecdotes from erstwhile group members and Sircar's former wife, that Sircar had become a celebrity and a phenomenon unto himself. The institutionalization of what was purported to be an egalitarian effort further alienated the third theatre and its grassroots practitioners from its fountainhead of ideas, Badal Sircar. I would also like to emphasize that the style and philosophy of third theatre, a result largely of careless ideological import from the West, turned dated and static, not unlike similar imports in the history of the Kolkata-based Bengali theatre. Third theatre today, and it's still practiced, wears a jaded, tired, and hackneyed look as witnessed by the author during a performance of Sircar's Hattamala opare of the title, Beyond the Land of Hattamala, in 2012 by Shatabdi, Sircar's former group. Sircar's former colleagues remain steadfast in their adherence to the minimalism, choreography, and interactive style that became the cornerstone of the Sircar brand of theatre. The play, however, seemed distant and irrelevant, not having updated its content to reflect contemporary times. A mere relic of a revered theatre form rather than a living political entity. In many ways, it reminded one of Peter Brook's Battlefield, a sad reminder of what would have been a formidable theatrical intervention in facilitating purposeful cultural exchange. The issues with intercultural performance persist no matter which way, west to east to west, the borrowings proceed, unless the cultural barter is carefully nuanced and negotiated. And while Western hegemony ensures that Orientalism, be it in the form of colonial enterprise or the more liberal intercultural theater, can be a viable career option, Occidentalism, as seen in the case of Bengali theater and specifically with Badal Sircar's third theater, leads to a staid phenomenon, better fit for theoretical reflection rather than actual practice. This is the playwright receiving an honorary doctorate from my alma mater. So my alma mater has failed as well. It hasn't. I love that place. So where to from here? Stale old wine in a new bottle or some concluding thoughts? Royona Mitra locates the genesis of her scholarship and Akram Khan's choreography within a British society where cultural diversity was being encouraged. Mitra studies Khan's evolving choreography as an interaction of his formative training in Kathak, the South Asian classical dance form, and his formal training in modern dance. The resulting new interculturalism, as Mitra claims for Khan's work, showcases a socio-politically dynamic aesthetic that celebrates cultural similarities without discounting differences. Mitra sees Khan's choreographic aesthetic as an important critical intervention that dislodges what Una Chaudhary has called, and I quote, the handful of works and artists that have occupied interculturalism's center stage, end quote. Her enumeration of the points of departure that set Khan's work apart from what she identifies as, and I quote, predominantly white Western project of intercultural theater, end quote, is central to understanding where Mitra locates Khan both inside and yet outside the intercultural spectrum, and therefore a new interculturalism. Mitra cites Khan's embodied experience of being an insider-outsider to multiple cultural milieus, his personal and embodied starting points for his works, which make the works more accessible while not threatening the source culture, and the ambivalent and ephemeral quality of his aesthetic as distinguishing qualities of his work. This is Akram Khan. If you have not seen Akram Khan dancing, look him up on YouTube. It's spellbindingly beautiful. Desh would be my favorite. When seen under the critical light that Mitra had shed on Khan and his role in the evolution of a new British dance aesthetic, the shortcomings of the intercultural in Sircar's work in late 20th century Bengal become even more evident. Khan's choreography offers a bold new look into what British modern dance ought to look like in an increasingly diverse Britain. It is a new product that combines the best of several worlds and yet does not owe its allegiance to any one of them. Sircar, on the other hand, bought into a white Western project of interacting with Eastern cultural artifacts. He adopted the broad-based, essentialized, and therefore reductive Western view of India into the body of his work, inaugurating in the process a theater that was a domestic version of an Occidental project. The always already intercultural environment of the Bengali theater welcomed Sircar's intervention as an experimental innovator, but once the novelty wore off, the politically bereft cultural commodity of his work was relegated to the sidelines, as it could not evolve beyond its immediate context. Ultimately, Khan's work is political. It is as unabashedly South Asian in Britain as it is British, thus exposing what Mitra hails as a multi-layered version of his self as the new intercultural subject beyond the narrow definition of cultural appropriation and the constraints of the post-colonial. And it is here that Sircar in particular and Bengali group theater in general have very often failed to distinguish themselves from the way the West wanted us to imagine ourselves and to imagine something new instead. Thank you.
I feel like Alice, and I've just walked into a wonderland that there's so many names and places that I need to look up on internet now. Do we have any questions for Our speaker tonight, yes, Chris?
Chris. Yeah. Desh.
Can you?
Desh. It's really beautiful. He has stopped dancing solo. He formally retired from dancing solo. I don't know why he retired as soon as he did, but he doesn't do that anymore. But it's just stunning. It's beautiful. Leon.
In your description of the Sircar's process of trying to
Mhm.
create this third theater, it reminded me of Tadashi Suzuki.
Yeah.
Have you done any comparisons between those two?
I have not, but that would be, I think, a very interesting next step. But I have not looked at Suzuki's choreography, not performance training as much. But I think that what distinguishes Suzuki from Sircar is Suzuki's formidable training in formal theater, which Sircar did not really have. His training was very piecemeal because he comes out of an amateur theater culture. So I think that would be a distinguishing characteristic of it. But no, I haven't looked at it in any great depth. But that's a good pointer. Yeah, thank you. Alada.
You criticize Sircar for failing in the, intermixing or borrowing from the Western and then kind of staying there.
Right.
And you also mentioned that, sausage eating and then
Yeah, beer guzzling German.
the beer garden Germans can do, it cannot be done by the sensitive Indian culture. But I actually, we both went to a theater that was Harir Gondi, the Caucasian chalk circle, that was translated very much into Bengali and was performed, astonishingly beautifully in India. So, are you generalizing without or not giving, I will say, credence to the fact that there are multiple layers of India, and therefore trying to fit Sircar into all of them may be not justified? I think there is a lot of group theaters, and that has actually translated from Western, but managed to completely create a context for the urban, middle class, upper class, whatever you
Right,
call
right,
it.
right.
But that is also true in India. I mean, when we have been ruled by 250 years by a colony, then there is a colonial India. Whether we like it or not doesn't matter. It's still India.
Right.
And
Yeah.
for them, this is extremely relevant.
Sure.
And kind of, embodies the culture. So isn't that also a form of borrowing from the West and then kind of fitting in within what part of Indian
Right. Yeah, no, and I think I addressed that briefly since that is not what I can talk about at length as the topic of this paper. I do find that problematic, that this constant stream of borrowing from Western theater in order to define modern Indian theater. I find that to be a problematic trope, because I don't think those experiences always translate. Again, they're aesthetically brilliant. I mean, if you look at Periolar Mrityu, Death of a Salesman, that Nandikar did, that is an aesthetically brilliant production, right? Even Football, brilliant production. 6 characters, if you have seen that, also brilliant production when done in Bengali. What is Bengali about it? What is the reality that it translates? So at what point is it simply making a Western art form available to an urban audience in Calcutta? And is that the only purpose that this theater should serve, to be a conduit for another aesthetic structure? It can be, and I mean, when I was active in Bengali group theater, that is the kind of place that I was doing constantly, Western adaptations. But should the theater only focus on that rather than try to find out elements where it can distinguish itself as a distinct urban phenomenon? And that is where, and that is not the topic of this particular paper, but that is something that I think we need to mull over as well. And I think Sircar's success at the time that he got the success was because he was also fitting into that imagination. That look at all these lovely styles, look at all these abstractions that he's able to bring in to the urban aesthetic. rather than distinguishing the form of theater that was practiced in Calcutta, which I personally find to be something that is lacking in Calcutta theater. In certain playwrights, it's definitely less, and it's very difficult to make that subjective call, obviously. But for vast majority of it, it's just reproducing, which it's not as aesthetically satisfying, at least personally. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.